The night was calm, the kind that lulled men into arrogance. Beneath the moonlit surface, I-41, a Japanese submarine, moved silently through warm Pacific currents. Its captain leaned over the plotting table, confident. The Americans, he told his crew, wasted steel on foolish contraptions. Spigots that fired forward instead of dropping their charges astern. They cannot hit what they cannot see. Then the sonar operator stiffened. A sharp metallic pulse echoed through the hull. Ping, ping, ping. The destroyer was closing fast, but the captain waited, expecting the usual. Depth charges always fell behind. One chance to dive deep, turn hard, and slip away. That had always worked, only this time the ocean betrayed him. The pings grew faster. Then, a sound no one had ever heard before, a stuttering roar like metal rain. Dozens of projectiles arced through the night sky, hissing as they entered the water ahead of the submarine. 30 small explosions followed, but not all at once. One after another, each closer, each sharper. The crew barely reached the diving planes before the pressure hull shattered. Above, on the bridge of USS England, a sailor whispered, "The Hedgehog works." In the early years of World War II, the ocean was a graveyard of guesses. For both sides, anti-submarine warfare was more ritual than science, a mix of intuition, timing, and luck. Destroyers and corvettes carried racks of depth charges, heavy steel cylinders filled with high explosive and set to detonate at pre-chosen depths. When sonar detected a contact, the ship raced forward, dropped its load astern, and hoped one of the explosions happened near enough to crush a submarine's hull. It was a brutal but inefficient system. The shockwaves deafened the destroyer's own sonar, forcing it to break contact just when accuracy mattered most. And the ocean, wide and deceptive, offered the submarine 1,000 ways to escape. A battle of instincts. For the men aboard escort ships, every attack felt like throwing stones into the dark. The sonar operator heard a faint echo, called out bearing and range. The captain ordered, "Stand by depth charges." Then came the roar, a thunder of cascading explosions behind the ship. The sea boiled white. Smoke rolled over the stern, and every man waited for oil to rise, the only proof of a kill. Most times, nothing surfaced. The target had slipped away. In 1941 and 1942, British and American escorts expended hundreds of depth charges for every confirmed sinking. Convoys still lost ships weekly. A U-boat or Japanese submarine needed only one lucky shot. A destroyer needed perfect luck to score even once. The submariner's advantage, submarines, meanwhile, thrived on that chaos. Their greatest weapon was silence. After launching torpedoes, they simply listened, hearing the explosions astern, counting the seconds, feeling for the gaps between depth charges. Those gaps meant life. Japanese captains in particular held deep faith in the ocean's geometry. They believed that once submerged beyond 300 feet and zigzagging, no surface ship could touch them. The enemy's sonar beams scattered. The destroyer would pass overhead, and by the time it circled back, the sub would be gone. This pattern repeated across oceans, the same deadly dance of uncertainty. The Americans called it chasing ghosts. The Japanese called it the music of escape. But as 1943 approached, the Allies grew tired of missing. Somewhere in Britain, an engineer looked at the charts of failed attacks and noticed something no admiral had seen. Every explosion happened behind the contact. The solution, when he sketched it, was absurdly simple. Attack forward. The birth of an idea. The Royal Navy's laboratories at Fairlie, Scotland, began experimenting with a new concept: small, contact-fused bombs that could be launched ahead of the ship in a tight pattern. They would detonate only upon striking metal, not water pressure, allowing sonar to stay active until the moment of impact. No more breaking contact, no more guessing. The first prototype resembled a cluster of short steel tubes mounted on the forecastle. 48 launch spigots, angled outward like the quills of some mechanical porcupine. The sailors who saw it laughed. Someone nicknamed it the Hedgehog, and the name stuck. When tested in late 1942, it performed beyond expectation. The bombs flew 250 yards ahead, entered the sea almost silently, and if one touched a submarine's hull, the explosion was instantaneous and lethal. There were no wasted detonations, no acoustic confusion. For the first time in naval history, a ship could see, aim, and strike in one continuous motion. By 1943, the weapon entered service aboard British destroyers and American destroyer escorts. Training manuals taught a new rhythm: maintain sonar lock, fire a pattern, listen. No eruption of bubbles or water columns to obscure the contact. If the sonar echo vanished and an explosion followed, the kill was confirmed. The math changed everything. With depth charges, a destroyer's success rate had been 1 in 80 attacks. With Hedgehog, it rose to 1 in 6, and soon word of it spread across the Pacific. Japanese captains began hearing reports of submarines lost without warning. No depth charge detonations, no surface pursuit, just sudden silence after a single salvo. The era of intuition was ending. The age of calculated destruction had begun. By early 1943, the Hedgehog system had crossed the Atlantic, from the Royal Navy's testing grounds at Fairleigh to the production lines of American shipyards. In a war defined by convoys and submarines, it was a small, almost unremarkable invention, just 40 spigots welded to a ship's bow. Yet its simplicity masked its genius. It solved every flaw of the old method in a single stroke. Depth charges exploded blindly. Hedgehog waited for contact. Depth charges forced destroyers to break sonar. Hedgehog kept the target on screen until the last moment. Depth charges terrorized the ocean. Hedgehog killed silently. American adoption. The U.S. Navy, always cautious about British designs, at first treated Hedgehog as a curiosity. American destroyer captains preferred the roar of their K-guns, side-firing depth-charge projectors that blanketed the sea behind the ship. But as convoy losses mounted and submarine kills lagged, even skeptical admirals began to notice the numbers. In late 1943, a batch of new destroyer escorts, DEs, leaner, sonar-equipped warships built for convoy defense, began receiving Hedgehog mounts on their bows. Among them were ships like USS England, USS Shetland, and USS Whitehurst, vessels that would soon redefine anti-submarine warfare in the Pacific. American engineers refined the system further. They replaced the manual firing switches with electrical triggers linked directly to the sonar console. When the operator called "Target Steady, Range 300," the captain could fire immediately. No guesswork, no timing delay. The projectiles were 65-pound steel bombs packed with Torpex, each fused to explode only upon striking a solid surface. When they hit, the effect was devastating. A focused blast that punched straight through a submarine's hull before its crew even realized the water around them had changed. Japanese. Reactions, news of the new weapon filtered through the Pacific in fragments. Submarines failed to return. Patrol reports stopped mid-sentence. Intercepted radio chatter mentioned small explosions, followed by silence. But among Japanese commanders, disbelief prevailed. Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu, head of the 6th Fleet, dismissed early reports of forward-firing bombs as Allied boasting. Submarine captains mocked the rumor in their briefings, calling the weapon useless fireworks. "The Americans think they can throw stones ahead and hit the wind," one captain joked during training at Kure Naval Base. The Imperial Navy, still bound by faith in its traditional weapons, the long-range Type 95 torpedo, the silent periscope attack, saw no reason to fear Allied science. They had survived depth charges before. They would survive this too. What they didn't understand was that Hedgehog was not about power. It was about timing, and timing underwater meant everything. From the Atlantic to the Pacific. While the Hedgehog earned its first kills in the North Atlantic, sinking U-boats near Iceland and in the Bay of Biscay, its greatest impact would come thousands of miles away. In 1944, as the U.S. Navy pushed across the Pacific toward the Philippines, Japan began losing submarines faster than it could replace them. American escort groups, armed with Hedgehog and the latest sonar, QHB and QDA sets, formed mobile anti-submarine screens around carrier fleets and invasion convoys. Their tactics were crisp, mathematical, almost surgical. When a sonar contact appeared, they didn't circle and drop depth charges. They advanced straight toward the Echo, fired a pattern of 24 bombs, and maintained lock the entire time. Each attack took less than 2 minutes. It was no longer a duel. It was an execution. In February 1944, USS England, a new destroyer escort of the Evarts class, was on patrol near the Solomon Islands. Her sonar picked up a faint contact, range 1-200 yards. The operator tracked it until the range closed to 300. The captain ordered fire. 40 bombs shot forward, splashing in a tight oval. There was silence for a few seconds, then a muffled thump, the unmistakable sound of a hull imploding. Oil and wreckage rose to the surface. It was over in 30 seconds. The captain radioed in. Contact confirmed destroyed. Hedgehog successful. From that moment, every Japanese submarine commander in the Pacific began to hear the same story. The strange sound of spigots firing, followed by nothing but light, bubbles, and silence. The tide turned. By the end of that year, the U.S. Navy credited Hedgehog-equipped ships with over 50 confirmed submarine kills across both oceans. The Japanese Sixth Fleet had lost a third of its active boats. Their vaunted silent service was dying, not through attrition, but through mathematics. And still some captains refused to believe it. They called the Hedgehog a lucky weapon, its success exaggerated by American propaganda. But the ocean doesn't lie. The wrecks told the truth. The age of the guessing game was over. The war beneath the waves had become a contest of precision. And, for the first time, the sea favored the hunter. Mechanical precision, the Hedgehog's quiet violence. Hedgehog was terrifying because it was almost insultingly simple. 40 or so steel spigots mounted on a ship's bow. Each spigot fired a 65-pound contact bomb in a preset arc. Each bomb carried torpex and a fuse that only detonated on impact with metal. No pressure-triggered detonations, no wasted underwater concussions that deafened a ship's own sonar. Only an immediate, localized explosion when hull met warhead. The pattern mattered. The spigots were angled so the projectiles splashed down in an oval roughly 250 to 300 yards ahead of the ship. Fired together, the salvo blanketed the sonar contact with lethal geometry. Where depth charges were an imprecise carpet soaked in noise, Hedgehog was a scalpel, a ring of metal that arrived before the target knew it had been struck. Equally important was the fuse. Because each charge only went off on contact, a miss remained silent. No masking detonation, no reverberation to scramble the sonar. The attacking ship could keep its echo on the screen, refine the solution, and if necessary launch another salvo immediately. This preserved the critical information stream that had been lost to the old method. Mechanics turned into inevitability. Hedgehog didn't rely on brute force. It relied on timing and contact. A single direct hit exploded inward, cracking pressure hulls and collapsing compartments. For submariners who trusted depth and silence, that inward shock was lethal and sudden. The spigots looked like toys. They behaved like death delivered by calculation. Tactical integration, sonar, speed, and the forward strike. Hedgehog's brilliance was not just hardware. It was doctrine. Sonar, ASDIC variants in Allied service, supplied continuous bearing and range. Hedgehog made that continuity lethal by letting the ship attack toward the Echo instead of away from it. The escort no longer had to lose contact to drop patterns aft. It could close, fire, and maintain lock through the entire sequence. Tactically, this changed the escort's decision tree. The captain could hold course on the contact, charge to optimal firing range, and release a pre-calculated pattern timed to intercept the sub's predicted position. The engagement became a math problem. Closure rate, target angle, spread geometry. Training converted that math into muscle memory. Attacks took a minute or two, not the long, noisy circles of depth-charge doctrine. The consequences were immediate. Submarine evasive maneuvers, random turns, deep dives, even releasing decoys, were far less effective when the attacker retained a continuous acoustic picture. Hedgehog reduced the defender's options to one terrible choice: endure contact or be struck. Multiple escort vessels, each armed with Hedgehog, could layer attacks in quick succession, turning fleeting contacts into fatal funnels. The ocean stopped being a place of guesses and became a space of calculated interception. Crew and training. From guesswork to Drill A, new weapon demands new crews. Hedgehog required precision drills. Sonar operators trained to hold a steady echo under stress. Fire control teams practiced setting spread geometry until the sequence was reflex. Bridge officers learned to close at exact speeds to place the pattern where the sonar predicted the sub would be. The tempo of attack accelerated. Confidence replaced panic. On the Allied side, this produced a culture of immediate competence. Young sonar men learned to trust the screen and speak in crisp phrases. Range 320. Target steady. Firing. The captain's decision loop compressed: detect, close, fire, confirm. And each step had been rehearsed dozens of times in calm and in chaos. Because the weapon did not require the ship to turn or lose contact, doctrine emphasized aggression. Hold the echo. Don't circle away. For the submarine crews, the change was brutal. Their old survival drills, wait out the depth charge pattern, listen for prop washing, time the escort search, no longer worked. The silent, single salvo arrived while their men still counted propeller turns. Hedgehog turned a submarine's acoustic sanctuary into a countdown clock. Very few had the training to convert fear into an effective new evasive geometry. The human edge gave way to the trained edge. Ship design and doctrine. Small mounts, big consequences. Hedgehog fit into the new escort ship designs like a missing tooth in a jaw. Destroyer escorts, DEs, frigates, and corvettes were built for sustained convoy watches and ASW screens. The bow-mounted Spigot cluster suited these hulls perfectly. It required no massive retrofitting, only stable foredeck space and electrical firing circuits tied to sonar. That made widespread adoption fast and inexpensive, a crucial advantage in wartime. Doctrinally, Hedgehog encouraged distributed ASW. A single escort could now aim a precise strike, but groups of escorts could lexically coordinate overlapping patterns to deny escape corridors. That tactical shift freed capital ships from lone hunt responsibilities and turned escort groups into disciplined anti-submarine swarms. Merchant convoys gained an active shield rather than a reactive barrage. On the Japanese side, doctrine lagged. Submarine captains accustomed to avoiding escort sterns now faced concentrated fire ahead of the convoy, a place they had assumed safe. The psychological shock was as operational as the mechanical damage. Hedgehog didn't need fleet-wide replacement. It needed doctrine and crews who could integrate sonar and weapons into a single, unbroken act. Once Allied navies did that, the results were swift and irreversible. The technical needle had been threaded through the heart of submarine warfare: timing, contact, and continuity. The engineers who designed Hedgehog saw a pattern of arcs and angles. The sailors who used it saw ghosts. And the submariners who faced it heard death coming, quietly, through the water. To the men inside Japanese submarines, Hedgehog changed the soundscape of war. Depth charges had been loud, thunderous, predictable. When they fell, crews braced, counted, prayed, then surfaced if they lived. The blasts might go on for minutes, a kind of perverse reassurance. Noise meant they were still alive. Hedgehog was different. There was only the faint clicking of sonar pings, then the metallic patter of dozens of projectiles slicing into the sea ahead. A moment of waiting, no detonation, no rhythm to gauge, and then a single, precise impact that tore through steel and water alike. Submariners later said that silence had become the worst sound of all. When we heard nothing, one survivor recalled, We knew the Hedgehog was coming. The USS England Hunt-Nose ship embodied Hedgehog's power better than USS England, DE-635. Between May 19th and May 31st, 1944, in a stretch of ocean north of the Solomons, she sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days, a record unmatched in naval history. Each kill followed the same rhythm: sonar contact, closing run, Hedgehog salvo, confirmation. The crews of the doomed subs barely had time to maneuver. England's sonar operators called out bearings in clipped monotone: range 300. Steady. Fire. The projectiles hit in seconds. The explosions followed. The echoes never returned. Admiral Ernest King would later say, "There will always be an England." But for Japanese captains, the name meant something else entirely. It meant inevitability. Shock across the empire. By mid-1944, Japanese fleet headquarters could not ignore the reports. Submarines sent to track American convoys vanished without contact. Radio logs ended mid-transmission. In Tokyo, officers argued over the cause. Some claimed sabotage. Others blamed new Allied sonar. Few accepted the truth that the Americans had turned prediction into weaponry. The Imperial Navy's Technical Bureau attempted countermeasures: deeper dives, rubber coating to absorb sonar, new evasive manuals. None worked. The mathematics of Hedgehog ignored superstition. Its salvos operated faster than human instinct. In diaries recovered after the war, Japanese commanders confessed an emotion they had once despised: fear. "We can no longer hear them coming," one wrote. "Only the pings, and then the sea explodes." The terror spread beyond the submariners. Surface captains, once confident that their undersea arm could ambush American fleets, now viewed submarines as expendable scouts. Missions were shortened, morale fell, and training schools emptied. Of the 128 Japanese subs operational in 1944, more than half were lost within 12 months. Sailors described dreams of the lightless ocean lit suddenly by dozens of falling sparks, the Hedgehog bombs entering water above them like descending stars. In post-war interrogations, one officer called it a rain that never misses. That was the psychological victory, not just the destruction of machines, but the erasure of hope in invisibility. The Allies had made the sea transparent. The view from the surface aboard, the destroyers, Hedgehog inspired a strange, quiet pride. Unlike the drama of depth-charge attacks, there was no spectacle, only a calm command: fire, pause, impact. Crews spoke of killing with precision. Some found it unsettling: no chase, no noise, just a single shudder through the hull as the submarine below was torn apart. In logbooks, captains wrote simply: contact lost, explosion heard, oil sighted. Behind those words lay hundreds of men who never resurfaced. The sea that had once been their ally now marked their graves. The war beneath the waves had turned from art to arithmetic. The hunters who once relied on instinct and darkness now fought in a world measured by ping, range, and probability. And that world was closing in fast. The Pacific. May 1944. The American push toward the Marianas was underway, and Japan's submarine fleet, once a proud arm of the Imperial Navy, had been reduced to shadows on sonar screens. But the few that remained were determined to strike one last blow. 6 submarines were ordered south of the Solomon Islands to intercept the invasion convoys. The Americans sent 6 destroyer escorts to protect those convoys. Among them was USS England, DE-635, a name the Japanese would soon learn to fear. May 19th, the first kill at 13:25 hours. England's sonar picked up a faint contact northwest of Bougainville. The crew had trained relentlessly for this. Sonar operator Bill Kelly called the bearing in steady rhythm: target steady, range 1-500, 1-200, 800. The ship advanced, bow angled toward the echo. Captain Walton Pendleton gave the order: fire Hedgehog. 24 projectiles arced out ahead, splashing in a perfect oval. For 5 seconds there was silence, then 4 detonations, sharp and heavy. The sonar screen went blank. Oil and debris surfaced moments later. The target, later identified as I-16, was gone. 1 salvo, 1 kill. The crew stood stunned. No depth-charge thunder, no long pursuit, just mathematics, silence, and then confirmation. They had witnessed the future of naval warfare. May 22, 23. A pattern emerges. 3 days later, England was still on patrol when another contact appeared. This one tried to dive deep, executing a spiral descent that once would have saved it. The sonar lock held. The firing pattern adjusted. Hedgehog rounds entered the sea at calculated spacing, descending faster than the submarine could turn. Again, 4 impacts. Another submarine, RO-106, was destroyed. Hours later, England's sister ship, USS George, picked up the next contact. Both escorts maneuvered in a pincer formation, one maintaining sonar lock, the other firing. RO-104 vanished beneath their combined salvos. Each kill came quicker than the last. By now, the crews moved like a machine. Detect, approach, fire, confirm. The process felt detached, almost surgical. What had once been a duel of hunters had turned into a harvest. May 24-26, the night of 3 victories, the third engagement came under darkness. Radar picked up periscope wakes. Sonar confirmed. England raced ahead of her escort screen, closing to 300 yards. The first salvo missed, no explosion. The sonar lock remained. Pendleton ordered a second. 16 seconds later, 2 detonations. RO-116 sank with all hands. At dawn on May 25th, another contact. RO-108. The pattern was familiar now. The Hedgehog bombs hit. The echo vanished. Within hours, the Americans sighted wreckage from yet another sub, RO-105. In less than a week, 6 submarines, half of the operational Japanese Sixth Fleet in that region, were destroyed. No American ship suffered a scratch. The ocean, once the domain of uncertainty, had become a predictable grid. The message reaches. Tokyo news of the losses arrived in fragments. Reports of submarines overdue. Last radio positions marked. Silence. At Imperial Navy headquarters, Admiral Komatsu ordered a review. The reports defied explanation. No sightings. No surface ships reported. All losses sudden. An intercepted American transmission soon provided the answer. It was a dispatch from the commander of USS England, 6 down in 12 days. Recommend more Hedgehogs. The sentence spread through the Japanese fleet like a whisper of doom. Submariners had no counter. They could dive deeper, slow their engines, release decoys. But nothing stopped the forward-thrown salvos that arrived faster than the ocean could react. The sound of certainty for Allied escorts. The rhythm of the hunt became eerily consistent. The sonar pinged, the range closed, the light on the console blinked green, and the firing sequence began. To the trained ear, the Hedgehog's launch had a particular cadence. Metallic, quick, almost cheerful. Sailors nicknamed it the typewriter. Each key struck meant another attack, another target erased. At night, the salvos looked almost beautiful. Sparks of muzzle flash arced forward, then vanished into black water. Seconds later, faint plumes broke the surface, followed by the low rumble of explosions deep below. The airmen overhead watching from patrol planes described it as the sea breathing fire. By June, Japanese submarines had virtually disappeared from the Central Pacific. The Imperial Navy had lost not just vessels but the illusion of stealth that defined them. The Americans had turned sonar data into death, light arcs into annihilation. The ocean had learned a new language, geometry, rhythm, inevitability, and USS England had become its fluent speaker. But even as the kills mounted, the weapon itself was evolving, and a final demonstration of its precision would soon annihilate what remained of Japan's undersea force. By autumn of 1944, the Pacific had changed its color. What once shimmered with the threat of unseen predators now glistened under absolute Allied control. The American fleet was advancing toward the Philippines, and with it came not just carriers and battleships, but a vast, invisible shield of destroyer escorts armed with sonar, radar, and Hedgehog launchers. The Japanese called it the Cage of the Sea. Every convoy, every carrier task force, every invasion fleet moved inside that cage, watched by sonar, guarded by mathematics. The Philippines, October 1944, the last offensive. The Imperial Japanese Navy, desperate to disrupt the Leyte invasion, ordered nearly all remaining operational submarines to converge in the central Philippines. 30 boats were dispatched. Most never returned. On the night of October 25th, one of these, I-56, surfaced to recharge batteries off Samar. Its commander had no radar, no escort, and no reason to expect company. The sea seemed empty. But 30 miles away, USS Whitehurst detected a faint sonar return, an anomaly at 180 feet, steady bearing. "Target holding," the operator said. The captain gave the order. "Hedgehog, stand by." A minute later, 24 bombs entered the water in perfect symmetry. No sound, then 5 detonations. The sonar echo vanished. At dawn, an oil slick 600 yards wide shimmered on the waves. That was the 5th submarine destroyed that week. The Imperial Command refused to believe the reports. They blamed faulty machinery, mines, even self-detonation. But survivors later rescued from lifeboats described the same horror. Small splashes, then everything broke. The final sweep. Okinawa. March 1945 by 1945. Japan's submarine force was fighting for survival, not victory. The remaining boats, many built hastily and manned by barely trained crews, were sent on suicidal missions against the massive American invasion fleets. But the destroyers guarding those fleets, Fletcher-class, Buckley-class, and Evarts-class escorts, were no longer blind hunters. They were machines built around the Hedgehog's logic. Each had sonar integrated directly with firing control. Each captain could strike instantly the moment a contact was confirmed. In early March, as the Okinawa invasion loomed, the Americans formed what they called killer groups, roving teams of destroyer escorts that hunted subs instead of waiting for them. One of these, led by USS Finnegan, encountered I-370 south of Okinawa. Within minutes, the Hedgehog salvos struck home. Explosions bloomed under the surface, and the sonar echo ceased. It was over in 30 seconds. The same week, USS Silverstein, USS Ulvert M. Nimor, and USS Parks each recorded separate kills, all with Hedgehog fire. Each submarine lost represented not just a hull, but an entire doctrine dying in real time. The Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled on stealth and silence. The Allies had replaced both with data and precision. Back in the quiet workshops of Britain and America, the scientists who had designed the Hedgehog read the reports with a detached pride. There were no medals for them, only lines in technical summaries. Weapon efficiency exceeds projections. Maintain production. But in truth, they had rewritten centuries of naval combat. Before Hedgehog, sea warfare had been an art of pursuit. After Hedgehog, it became a science of prediction. Ships no longer hunted by instinct, they calculated. And that shift, multiplied across hundreds of escorts, destroyed Japan's submarine arm more completely than any battle ever could. A vanishing fleet by mid-1945, Japan had launched 190 ocean-going submarines since the war's start. Of those, 129 were lost. Only a handful survived to surrender in August. The Sixth Fleet, once confident in the vast Pacific, had been reduced to rumor. Their commanders no longer planned attacks. They wrote farewell notes before diving. American sailors called the new sonar tracks dead echoes, the brief, trembling signals of submarines that never surfaced again. In Tokyo, the admirals stopped reading the loss lists aloud. They simply stamped them, presumed sunk. The end of a doctrine. In the end, Hedgehog did more than sink submarines. It buried the old philosophy of naval war. The Japanese had built their silent service on courage, stealth, and intuition. The Allies replaced those virtues with circuits, patterns, and probabilities. A destroyer could now fight in total darkness and still strike unseen enemies with surgical accuracy. That change, the quiet transfer of power from instinct to information, was irreversible. It would guide the design of post-war navies, sonar systems, and anti-submarine weapons for decades, and it began with one small cluster of steel spigots on a destroyer's bow. The Pacific had once been ruled by the unseen. Now it belonged to those who could see through silence. The Hedgehog didn't just end an enemy, it ended an era. Before 1943, the ocean was a fog of uncertainty, a place where sound distorted, where men fought shadows on sonar screens and guessed where the enemy might be. After Hedgehog, that fog began to clear. For the first time in naval history, technology granted human beings a measurable sense of certainty beneath the waves. The Atlantic and Pacific were littered with wrecks that proved it. Submarines that once slipped away with quiet arrogance now lay split open on the seabed. Hulls crushed, engines exposed like broken organs. Japanese crews, who had once been the predators of the Pacific, were now its ghosts. A statistical revolution. In the months after Japan's surrender, the U.S. Navy compiled the cold arithmetic of the war beneath the sea. Hedgehog had achieved a kill ratio 13 times higher than depth charges. Ships equipped with the system recorded over 180 confirmed submarine kills across both theaters, more than any other single anti-submarine weapon. But the numbers told only part of the story. What mattered more was how the weapon changed behavior. Before Hedgehog, sonar contact often meant frustration, hours of pursuit, wasted ordnance, and silence. After Hedgehog, it meant action. Captains became hunters again. Convoys moved confidently through waters that once felt haunted. Merchant sailors who had prayed for protection now saw their escorts advance aggressively toward danger instead of turning away to drop explosives behind them. Even among crews hardened by war, the psychological impact was immense. It was the first time, one destroyer officer later said, that we felt the ocean could be ours. The end of submarine romanticism. For a century, submarines had been romanticized as the ghosts of modern warfare. Silent, daring, invincible. Germany had made them a symbol of technical defiance in the Atlantic. Japan saw them as weapons of destiny in the Pacific. Hedgehog shattered that myth. The weapon didn't make submarines obsolete. It made them visible. The deep was no longer infinite. Every sound, every echo, every reflected ping could now be plotted, measured, and attacked. The shift reverberated through naval academies worldwide. Where earlier generations had studied Mahan's theories of decisive fleet battles, the new generation studied sonar geometry and underwater acoustics. Naval strategy had moved from valor to vectors. And the most humbling part for Japan's admirals came not from defeat in open battle, but from realization. They had been undone by engineers. Not by admirals, not by pilots, but by quiet minds with slide rules, chalkboards, and prototypes. Britain's engineers and America's system builders. The partnership that birthed Hedgehog, British innovation, American mass production, became a model for post-war research collaboration. The Royal Navy's experimental laboratories at Fairlie, and later the Admiralty Research Establishment at Portland, continued to refine the concept. The Americans followed with the Weapon Alpha, an automated Hedgehog successor with longer range and larger payload. It was not just a weapon. It was a philosophy. The key was continuous sonar contact, instantaneous fire, and precision geometry. Every improvement in post-war sonar, from analog cathode displays to digital processors, followed that same doctrine. The goal was no longer to make explosions stronger, but to make decisions faster. By 1946, the Cold War had barely begun, but the blueprint for its underwater dimension already existed, laid down by the modest Spigot launcher that had once sat on the deck of USS England. The Allies had built a machine that could think faster than fear. But its success had also revealed something deeper, that future wars would be won not by courage alone, but by calculation. The war ended, but Hedgehog's echo never faded. Its principle, strike forward with precision, not backward with noise, became the genetic code of modern anti-submarine warfare. Every navy that studied the wrecks of 1945 drew the same conclusion. Future oceans would belong to those who could calculate faster than the enemy could hide. Britain's Squid and Limbo, the evolution of the pattern by 1946. The Royal Navy had already begun replacing Hedgehog with a deadlier descendant, Squid. Instead of 40 small contact bombs, Squid launched 3 large 390-pound depth charges in a controlled triangular pattern. Unlike Hedgehog, which required a direct hit, Squid's charges detonated automatically at sonar-determined depths, ensuring lethal shockwaves even against deeper-diving post-war submarines. Squid's brilliance lay in automation. It was linked directly to the ship's sonar. Once the operator locked the target, the computer set range, bearing, and depth automatically. The captain merely pressed fire. A few years later, Limbo, an advanced 3-barrel mortar, refined the system even further with stabilized mounts and longer range, projecting. Explosive geometry, 1,000 yards ahead of a moving ship. These post-war designs carried Hedgehog's DNA. The idea had matured from experiment to doctrine. Fire forward, maintain contact, never lose the echo. America's Weapon Alpha and ASROC. The age of electronics across the Atlantic, the United States turned Hedgehog's principle into an electronic art form. In 1950, the Navy introduced Weapon Alpha, an automated, power-driven launcher that hurled a 250-pound charge nearly 800 yards ahead. Unlike Hedgehog, it required no manual alignment. Radar, sonar, and fire control computers calculated trajectory in real time. The weapon could be fired in rapid salvos, creating a lethal curtain beneath the surface. But the true descendant arrived a decade later. ASROC, anti-submarine rocket. It fired not a bomb but a torpedo. Guided by sonar data, the rocket lifted off the ship's deck, arced across the sky, and plunged its warhead into the exact sonar coordinate, sometimes miles away. It was Hedgehog's philosophy extended into the missile age. The weapon no longer needed to see its enemy. It simply followed the math. From the Spigots of 1943 to the rockets of 1961, the principle was identical. Continuous contact. Precision first. One motion from detection to destruction. The Cold War Ocean. A new kind of fear by the 1960s, the great navies of the world were no longer hunting Japanese or German submarines. They were hunting each other. Nuclear submarines could dive deeper, travel faster, and hide longer than any wartime design. Yet Hedgehog's descendants still ruled the pursuit. Sonar arrays spread beneath the waves. Computers mapped sound propagation through temperature layers. Destroyers and patrol aircraft worked together, feeding acoustic data into centralized command rooms, modern combat information centers that owed their very concept to the tactical rhythm Hedgehog had inspired. The ocean itself had become a nervous system, pulsing with pings and returns. The difference between 1944 and 1964 was scale. Where one destroyer had once tracked one target, now entire fleets tracked entire oceans. The language of sonar, the ping, the bearing, the range, remained. But the power behind it was digital, relentless, and invisible. It all traced back to that first moment when a single destroyer captain realized he didn't need to drop explosives behind him. He could aim forward and know. For the men who survived the submarine wars, Hedgehog represented a paradox. To Allied sailors, it was salvation, the weapon that turned the tide and saved convoys. To Japanese and German submariners, it was horror, the end of the silent refuge. Yet among engineers and historians it became something else entirely, a symbol of intellectual victory. A moment when science outpaced superstition, when calculation overcame chance. Every sonar buoy, every homing torpedo, Every digital fire control system carries a trace of that lineage. Even today, on modern destroyers, young sonar operators still hear echoes of those early pings. Their monitors may be digital, their weapons automatic, but the logic is unchanged. Track, range, fire, confirm. The Hedgehog's geometry remains alive in every modern strike. The Pacific War had ended 80 years ago, but beneath the waves, its mathematics never stopped expanding. What began as 40 spigots on the bow of a destroyer became the foundation of how humanity would think, fight, and navigate the unseen world below. The ocean was no longer a mystery. It had been mapped by sound and mastered by reason. The day the deep lost its secrets. War has a way of forcing human beings to look inward, into fear, into faith, and sometimes into the limits of their own imagination. The ocean, for centuries, had been the last refuge of those limits. It was where ships vanished, where sound distorted, where even light itself surrendered. For generations, men believed the sea could never be conquered, only endured. Then came the Hedgehog. It didn't roar like a cannon or thunder like a bomb. It whispered. It whispered mathematics, geometry, and patience. And in doing so, it changed forever how humanity looked at the water below. When Allied destroyers began firing Hedgehog salvos across the Atlantic and Pacific, they weren't just fighting submarines. They were proving that even the deep could be measured, mapped, and mastered. Every contact that vanished from sonar was another myth erased. The sea was no longer an unknowable expanse filled with ghosts and luck. It was a grid of coordinates, governed by physics and logic. In the Pacific, Japanese captains had believed that courage could outlast technology, that the silence of the deep was protection enough. But courage cannot outswim equations. The moment the first salvo struck, they understood what modern war had become. Not a contest of bravery, but of understanding. After the war, the oceans grew quiet again, but not ignorant. Beneath the calm, new machines listened, mapped, calculated. Every submarine, every torpedo, every sonar pulse that followed was a descendant of those first Hedgehog patterns fired from the bows of corvettes and destroyer escorts. The weapon's legacy was not destruction. It was perception. It taught navies, engineers, and even nations that dominance comes not from power alone, but from the ability to see clearly through uncertainty. Today, when a sonar screen glows in a modern warship's control room, green lines sweeping across an infinite grid, the operators who sit before it may not know the name Hedgehog. But they live in the world it created, a world where no ocean is silent, no target invisible, and no darkness without echo. It was the weapon that made the deep answer back, and from that moment onward, the sea would never again keep its secrets.